the road that shouldn't exist. In the American Southwest, there's a stretch of land where the dirt is a deep, bruised red and the horizon feels like it might swallow you whole. For decades, a specific strip of asphalt cutting through the desert was known as Route 666. It was paved in the 1920s as a simple way to connect the Four Corners region. At first, it was just a road. It was meant to bring commerce and travel to the isolated corners of New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. But as the years went on, people began to notice a pattern. It wasn't just that the number 666 carried a biblical weight that made people uneasy. It was the way the environment seemed to react to that number. Local law enforcement started seeing things that made no sense. It started with small things like engines dying for no reason in the middle of a clear afternoon. Drivers would find themselves stranded in triple-digit heat with a vehicle that was mechanically perfect just minutes before. Then came the sightings of things that had no business being in the desert. Travelers reported seeing flashes of light in the middle of the empty scrubland where there was no electricity for 50 miles. They heard voices over their scanners that sounded like static but carried a heavy, rhythmic breathing. Eventually, the death toll grew so high that it defied every statistical model used by the government. On most highways, accidents happen at intersections or sharp turns. But on Route 666, people were losing control of their cars on straight, flat stretches of road with perfect visibility. It became known as one of the most dangerous highways in America, not because of the terrain, but because of the sheer volume of unexplained fatalities. Local legends and police reports began to merge into a singular, terrifying reality. The people who lived near the road began to whisper that the asphalt itself had been cursed from the moment the first mile was laid down. Some roads are not just paths from one place to another. Sometimes there's something much more malevolent, the shadow in the rear view. One of the most frequent reports from people driving this highway at night involved a vehicle known as the Satanic Sedan. People would be driving at the speed limit, 65 miles per hour, when a pair of headlights would suddenly appear in the distance. At first, it looked like a normal car, but then the driver would notice that these lights weren't bobbing or reacting to the bumps in the road. They were perfectly level. The car behind them would move at an impossible speed, closing a mile-long gap in a matter of seconds. But it would never pass. Instead, it would pull up so close to their bumper that the driver could no longer see the other car's lights. They could only see a faint, flickering glow from the dashboard of a black, vintage sedan. Victims described the car as looking like it was made of shadows rather than metal. Drivers reported that no matter how much they accelerated, the black car stayed glued to them. If they hit 90 miles per hour, the sedan was right there. If they slammed on the brakes, the sedan would stop instantly without a single screech of tires. One man reported that he tried to outrun the car for 20 miles. He was terrified, watching his speedometer climb while this ancient black machine hovered inches from his trunk. Then, without warning, the sedan would swerve toward them as if to ram them off the cliffside. It was a game of psychological chicken played at lethal speeds. When the victims finally gathered the courage to look over and see who was behind the wheel, their blood went cold. The interior of the car was lit by a dim, sickly green light, and the driver's seat was completely empty. There was no one steering, no one shifting gears, just a ghost machine hunting for its next victim in the dark. The hounds and the skinwalkers. The Phantom sedan was not the only thing hunting on Route 666. There were also the Hounds of Hell. These were described as massive, yellow-eyed dogs with fur as black as coal. They didn't just stand on the side of the road. They ran alongside the cars. Witnesses reported looking out their side window while moving at 70 miles per hour only to see a dog keeping pace with them. Its paws hit the pavement with a heavy, rhythmic thud that could be felt through the chassis of the car. These animals were said to have the ability to shred tires with their teeth while the vehicle was in motion. One truck driver claimed he saw a pack of these creatures circling his rig while he was parked at a rest stop. When he turned on his high beams, they didn't run. They just stared, their eyes reflecting a light that didn't seem to come from his truck. But even more chilling were the sightings of the skinwalkers. In Navajo culture, These are harmful witches who can take the form of animals or strange, distorted humanoids. Drivers reported seeing figures standing in the middle of the road in the dead of night. The limbs were too long. The walk was unnatural, like someone whose bones had been broken and reset in the wrong places. In some accounts, these figures didn't just stand there. They would suddenly sprint toward the car with terrifying speed. One traveler described a night where a figure appeared in his peripheral vision while he was driving at highway speeds. He looked to his left and saw a pale, elongated face pressed against the glass of his window. It was keeping pace with him on foot. It was tapping on the glass with long, thin fingers while he was doing 70 miles per hour. This led to a local rule that everyone in the area knew by heart. If you see someone standing on a shoulder of Route 666 after the sun goes down, you do not stop. You don't even slow down to look at them. Breaking the hex. By the early 2000s, the reputation of the Devil's Highway had become so toxic that the governors of 3 states petitioned the federal government to change the name. They argued that the 666 designation was a literal curse. They claimed that the fear was so intense, it was actually killing the local economy. It was more than just a spooky nickname. It was a statistical nightmare that made people take hour-long detours just to avoid crossing that specific county line. Navajo officials joined the effort, stating that the number was causing a spiritual imbalance in the region. In 2003, after a long bureaucratic battle, the road was officially renamed U.S. Route 491. On the day the signs were being swapped out, dozens of them were stolen within hours of being installed. People wanted a piece of the cursed history before it was gone. In some cases, people were caught with power tools trying to unbolt the signs while the road crews were still on site. The government hoped that by changing the numbers, they could change the fate of the people who traveled there. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on new maps and rebranding efforts. They wanted the public to believe that the darkness was just a superstition tied to a name. They wanted to sanitize the history of the Four Corners. But as the new signs went up, many locals stayed quiet. They watched the metal 491 signs glint in the desert sun and felt a familiar chill. They knew that names are just labels, and labels don't change the land. You can repaint a door as many times as you want, but that doesn't change what is locked inside the room. The shadows that remain. Today, the road is officially Route 491, but the stories haven't stopped. In fact, many believe the renaming only served to hide the danger rather than remove it. The name on the map changed, but the geography remains exactly the same. The sharp, unforgiving turns are still there. The blinding dust storms that can appear out of nowhere still happen. The vast, empty stretches of desert where help is hours away are still there. People still report seeing the black sedan with no driver. Some modern accounts describe it as appearing more frequently since the name change, as if the road is trying to reclaim its original identity. They still see the yellow-eyed dogs running through the brush. One family traveling through New Mexico recently reported that their car was surrounded by 3 of these creatures when they stopped to check a flat tire. The dogs didn't growl. They just sat in a perfect circle around the car and waited until the sun began to rise. There is a specific phenomenon that has surfaced in recent years known as the lost hours. Travelers will be driving through a 20-mile stretch of the highway and realize that 3 hours have passed, even though they have no memory of stopping. They find their gas tanks nearly empty and their watches out of sync with their phones. This case is a reminder that you can rename a place, but you cannot always change what lives in the shadows. We like to think that we can control the world with paperwork and committees. We like to think that the monsters of the past can be erased with a simple change of a sign. But the desert has a much longer memory than we do. Sometimes the most terrifying things in this world don't care about what we call them. They were here before the first asphalt was poured, and they will be here long after the roads have crumbled back into the sand. They are part of the dirt and the wind and the silence. If you find yourself driving through the Four Corners tonight, keep your eyes on the road. Do not get distracted by the radio. Do not look for faces in the dust storms. And whatever you do, do not look in the back seat. Because if you see something there, it is already too late. Some places don't need miles of empty road to hide something wrong. Sometimes, The darkness settles in one house, on one quiet street, and refuses to leave. The house on Carolina Street looked ordinary enough. In 2011, a woman named Latoya Ammons moved into the small rental home in Gary, Indiana. She was with her mother, Rose Campbell, and her 3 young children. At first, it seemed like a fresh start in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. But within days of moving in, the atmosphere in the house shifted in a way that Latoya couldn't explain. It started with an invasion of black flies. Thousands of them suddenly covered the porch and the windows. Latoya would kill them, sweeping them into piles, only for them to return an hour later in even greater numbers. This wasn't a normal infestation. These flies were aggressive, and they seemed to be trying to get into the house through every crack in the foundation. Then came the smell. It was the scent of rotting meat mixed with heavy sulfur. It was a thick, cloying odor that would appear in one room and then move to another, as if something invisible was pacing through the house. Latoya tried every cleaning product she could find, but the stench would simply migrate to another floor. By the time the sun went down, the sound started. Latoya and her mother would sit in the living room and hear heavy, rhythmic footsteps on the basement stairs. It sounded like a large man was walking up to the kitchen door, only for the footsteps to vanish the moment they reached for the handle. Sometimes, they heard the unmistakable clanking of heavy metal chains being dragged across the concrete floor below. Latoya and her family tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was an old house with old pipes, or maybe just the settling of the foundation. They wanted to believe that there was a rational, logical reason for the dread that was beginning to suffocate them. But then, one night, the power in the house flickered and died. Latoya grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement door. When the beam of light hit the bottom of the stairs, she didn't see pipes or storage boxes. She saw a pair of glowing, predatory eyes staring back at them from the deep darkness of the corner. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. That was the moment they realized they weren't just living in a bad house with a pest problem. They were living in a trap that was slowly closing around them. The portal in the basement. As the weeks went on, the activity moved from sounds and smells to physical violence. It wasn't just that the house was haunted, it was that the house was active. Latoya's children began to change in ways that terrified her. They would speak in deep, gravelly voices that didn't belong to children. These voices were guttural and ancient, and they spoke about things no child should know. They would look at their mother with eyes that were cold and full of a focused, calculated hatred. One night, Latoya's mother woke up to see her grandson standing at the foot of her bed. He wasn't crying. He wasn't sleepwalking. He was crouched in a predatory position, growling like an animal. When she tried to speak to him, he bared his teeth and made a sound that she later described as a demonic hiss. But the most terrifying event happened in the basement. While investigating the source of the heavy footsteps, the family found a hidden room under the stairs. It was a small, cramped space that felt significantly colder than the rest of the house. It was filled with strange objects, including odd candles and journals, and the walls were stained with a dark substance that wouldn't wash away. The local police were called to the house multiple times. Initially, they thought it was a case of a family struggling with the stress of a new move or perhaps mental health issues. But the moment the officers stepped through the front door, the skepticism vanished. When the officers entered the home, their equipment began to fail in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Digital cameras would simply shut off with full batteries. Their radios, usually crystal clear, would emit a high-pitched shriek that forced the officers to turn them off. One officer reported that his flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the shadows in the kitchen, barely projecting more than a few inches. One veteran police captain, Charles Austin, walked into the house as a complete skeptic. He had seen everything the streets of Gary had to throw at him, but he walked out of that house as a believer. He reported seeing a shadow figure moving through the kitchen that was over 7 feet tall. It didn't have features, just a mass of darkness that was more solid than the air around it. He said the air in the house felt heavy and pressurized, as if it was physically pushing against his chest, trying to keep him from breathing. He told his fellow officers that he felt like something was watching him from every corner, waiting for him to make a mistake. The case that broke the system. What makes the Ammons case different from almost any other haunting in American history is the sheer volume of official, state-mandated documentation. This isn't just a story told by a frightened family over a campfire. It is an active case file held by the Department of Child Services, supported by sworn statements from medical professionals and law enforcement. A DCS caseworker named Valerie Washington was assigned to investigate the home. She was a seasoned professional, a woman who had spent her career in the toughest neighborhoods of Indiana and had seen every form of abuse and deception imaginable. She entered the Ammons house expecting to find a mother struggling with a breakdown. What she found instead was a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. During an interview at a local hospital, Valerie Washington and a registered nurse witnessed something that broke their understanding of the natural world. LaToya's 9-year-old son began to speak in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. Then, he began to walk backward up a wall. He didn't use his hands for leverage. He didn't scramble or climb. He simply leaned back and glided up the vertical surface as if gravity had been turned off just for him. He moved with a smooth, mechanical precision until he reached the ceiling. The nurse reported that the boy's eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. Once he reached the ceiling, he paused for a moment, looking down at the terrified adults. Then he flipped over in mid-air and landed silently on his feet directly in front of them. The caseworker and the nurse were so overwhelmed by what they saw that they bolted out of the room, refusing to go back in without security. In her official, signed report to the state, Washington wrote that the boy was gliding and stated clearly that there was no logical or medical explanation for what she had witnessed. It was a moment where the cold, hard system of the state government collided with something ancient and impossible. The state of Indiana eventually took the children into custody, believing that even if the mother wasn't causing the phenomena, the environment was too dangerous for them to remain. But the activity didn't stop at the property line. It followed the children into the sterile environment of the hospital and into their foster homes. Nurses reported that medical equipment would malfunction whenever the children were nearby, and one foster parent quit after only one night, claiming that a dark presence was pacing outside the children's bedroom door. The exorcism of Carolina Street, with the local police, the medical board, and the state government all acknowledging that something beyond their control was happening, LaToya Ammons realized that the law could no longer protect her. She turned to the only power she believed had a chance. She turned to the church. Father Michael Maginot, a priest at St. Stephen Martyr Parish, was assigned to investigate the case. He wasn't a man who went looking for ghosts. He was a disciplined, quiet scholar who spent his days focused on the needs of his congregation. But after he sat down with LaToya and her mother, and after he spoke with the police captain who had seen the 7-foot shadow, he knew this wasn't a mental health issue. He concluded that the house on Carolina Street wasn't just haunted. It was infested with hundreds of distinct, malevolent entities. He began a series of 3 exorcisms, 2 in English and 1 in Latin. During the rites, Father Maginot described the house itself reacting to the prayers as if it were a living organism. The moment he began the opening prayer, the temperature in the room would drop 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. Witnesses reported that their breath would mist in the air even though the furnace was running at full blast. The walls began to groan and vibrate with such force that it felt as if the house was being squeezed by a giant, invisible hand trying to crush the people inside. LaToya had to be physically restrained during the process. Her body would contort into angles that were physiologically impossible, and her skin would become boiling hot to the touch. She began to speak in multiple languages simultaneously, none of which she had ever studied. But the most chilling part was the secrets. She would lean close to Father Maginot and whisper private details about his childhood and his family that were buried in his own memory, things he had never told another soul. It was a calculated attempt to break his focus and his faith. The battle for the house reached a fever pitch in the basement. Father Maginot used a combination of holy water and blessed salt to seal the corners of the room where the eyes had first appeared. He later told the media that he felt he was standing at the edge of a literal portal to another dimension. He described the air in that basement as thick and oily, smelling of death and ancient rot. When the final rite was completed, the priest looked at Latoya and her mother. He didn't tell them the house was safe. He didn't tell them they could go back to sleep. Instead, he told them they had to leave everything behind and never look back. He told them the house wanted them there as fuel, and if they stayed, they wouldn't just lose their sanity. They would lose their souls to the things that were still clawing at the other side of that basement floor. The Demon House legacy. The Ammons family eventually moved out and never looked back. The children were returned to Latoya, and they moved to another state where the activity finally stopped. The house on Carolina Street sat empty for years. Neighbors reported seeing lights moving inside the boarded-up windows. In 2014, paranormal investigator Zach Bagans purchased the house. He wanted to document the portal for himself, but after spending only a few days inside, he ordered the house to be demolished. He said the energy was too dangerous to be left standing. He had the remains of the house buried in a secret location to prevent anyone from taking souvenirs. This case is a reminder that the world is much larger and darker than we like to admit. Sometimes the most official organizations in our society, the police and the government, have to admit that they have no answers. The demon house is gone now. There is just an empty lot where it used to be. But the people who live there and the officers who walk those halls still have nightmares. Because they know that just because you tear down a house, it doesn't mean you've closed the door. If you're sitting in your home right now and you hear a sound from the basement, don't go down to check. Just keep the lights on. The Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania. In the heart of Romania, just outside the city of Cluj-Napoca, lies a patch of land that locals have feared for centuries. It is called the Hoia Baciu forest. On the surface, it looks like any other woodland, but the moment you step beneath the canopy, the world begins to tilt. The forest has earned a reputation so dark that people call it the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania. And if you saw the trees, you'd understand why. They don't grow straight up toward the light like normal trees. Instead, they're twisted into permanent skeletal spirals, as if some invisible force has been wringing them like wet towels for decades. Scientists have tried to explain it away as a soil issue or a genetic mutation, but they can't explain why every single tree in certain groves follows the exact same unnatural clockwise curve. It's as if they were frozen while trying to crawl away from something in the earth. The legend of the forest truly began with a shepherd named Hoia. One afternoon, he led his flock of 200 sheep into the trees, looking for fresh grazing. He was a local, a man who knew the land well, so when he didn't return by nightfall, the village didn't panic immediately. But days turned into weeks. The search parties found nothing. No blood, no wool, no footprints. 200 sheep and a grown man simply ceased to exist in the middle of a forest that isn't even that large. It was as if the forest had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. Locals describe a heavy, suffocating silence that hangs over the area, a silence so profound that it feels like the air is pressing against your eardrums. There are no birds singing here. No squirrels chattering. Even the wind seems to die the moment it hits the tree line. When visitors enter, they often report an immediate and overwhelming sense of dread, followed by a physical weight on their chest that makes every breath feel like a struggle. It is as if the forest itself is a living, breathing organism that views humans as an unwelcome parasite. Since then, the Hoia Baciu has become a place where the laws of time and physics are merely suggestions. If you walk into those trees, you are entering a zone where the rules of the outside world no longer apply. It is a geographical anomaly where compasses spin wildly and electronic devices drain from full to zero in a matter of seconds. It is a place that feels less like a forest and more like a gateway to somewhere else entirely. The Lost Girl in the Pocket of Time. One of the most famous and well-documented accounts from the forest involves a 5-year-old girl who wandered into the trees while playing near the edge of her village. The entire community mobilized. They spent weeks scouring the brush, calling her name until their voices gave out. They used dogs, they used horses, they checked every ravine. Eventually, the reality set in. A 5-year-old could not survive the elements for that long. They gave her up for dead and held a memorial. The searchers reported a strange phenomenon while they were out in the woods. Many of them would enter a clearing and suddenly realize they had no idea which way was north, even with the sun directly overhead. Several experienced searchers became hopelessly lost in areas they had hunted in for decades, describing the forest as shifting its geometry whenever they weren't looking. 5 years later, the girl walked out of the forest and back into the village. She was wearing the exact same clothes she had disappeared in, and remarkably, the clothes still fit her perfectly. She hadn't aged a single day. Her skin was clean, her hair was brushed, and she showed no signs of dehydration or malnutrition. When the villagers questioned her, she was confused and frightened. To her, she had only been gone for a few minutes. She had been playing, she saw a light, and then she walked back home. She had no memory of the 5 years that had passed for everyone else. It was as if she had stepped into a pocket of time where the rest of the world stopped moving. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a recurring theme for those who dare to enter. Modern travelers report what researchers call time slips. They go for what feels like a 30-minute hike and emerge at sunset, only to find that their watches and phones show they have been missing for 12 or even 24 hours. The forest doesn't just take your life, it takes your time. It leaves you with the sense that you were never really in a forest at all, but rather standing in a corridor between two moments in history. The clearing where nothing grows. At the center of the Hoia Baciu is a place known as the Circle. It is a nearly perfect circular meadow where, for as long as records have existed, absolutely nothing grows. No trees, no bushes, not even a single blade of grass. It is a dead zone. Soil samples taken from the circle are chemically identical to the soil just 10 feet away where the vegetation is lush and overgrown. There is no biological, chemical, or geological reason for the clearing to exist. It is a scar on the land that refuses to heal. In 1968, a military technician named Emil Barnia was camping near the forest. He ignored the local warnings and decided to set up near the edge of the clearing. In the middle of the afternoon, he heard a low hum that vibrated through his boots. He looked up and saw a metallic, disc-shaped object hovering silently directly over the center of the circle. He managed to take a series of photographs before the object accelerated vertically and vanished. Those photos were later analyzed by experts and determined to be authentic, showing a craft that defied any known aviation technology of the time. But the locals know it isn't just about lights in the sky. It's about what the clearing does to you. People who step into the circle report immediate, intense physical symptoms. They experience sudden, blinding migraines, nausea, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched by thousands of eyes from the tree line. The air inside the perimeter feels static, as if a storm is about to break, but never does. Many emerge with unexplained physical marks. Circular burns on their skin, long scratches that look like they were made by claws, and rashes that appear and disappear in seconds. One researcher reported that when he stood in the exact center of the meadow, he could hear a sound like dozens of people whispering just inches from his ears, but when he turned around, he was completely alone in the open sun. Even the animals in the region refuse to enter the circle. Dogs will howl and pull at their leashes until their necks bleed to avoid crossing the perimeter, and horses have been known to bolt in terror if they even catch the scent of the clearing on the wind. It is as if the natural world knows this spot is occupied by something that doesn't belong here. It is a place where the earth has simply given up, leaving a void that refuses to be filled. The voices in the wind. If you talk to the people who live in Cluj-Napoca today, most will tell you they never go into the forest after dark. They describe hearing feminine voices laughing in the distance when the forest should be empty. They see glowing orbs of light that dance between the twisted trunks, leading travelers deeper into the thicket, away from the trails. One man reported that he was walking along a trail when he heard his mother's voice calling his name from the brush. It was clear, urgent, and familiar. He started to follow it, moving off the path into the dense, spiraled trees. But then he stopped. He remembered. His mother had been dead for 10 years. He turned and ran, and as he did, the voice changed. It stopped sounding like his mother and became a deep, electronic static that echoed through the trees, vibrating in his very skull. The Hoia Baciu is a place that feeds on your expectations. If you go in looking for ghosts, you will find them. If you go in looking for aliens, you will see the lights. But the truth is likely something much more ancient and much more indifferent to human understanding. It is a place where the veil between what we know and what we fear is at its thinnest. If you ever find yourself in Romania and you see the twisted trees of Hoia Baciu on the horizon, stay on the road. Some places were never meant to be explored. It's November 13th, 1974, in the small suburban town of Amityville, Long Island, New York. At the end of a quiet street, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and modest homes, sits a large Dutch colonial house with distinctive quarter-moon windows. The address is 112 Ocean Avenue. To the neighbors, it's a picture-perfect home for a picture-perfect family, the DeFeos. Inside live Ronald and Louise DeFeo and their 5 children. Ronald Jr., known as Butch, 23 years old, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John Matthew, just 9. From the outside, they look like a normal middle-class family. But behind closed doors, tensions run deep. Ronald Sr. is known for his violent temper. Friends and relatives later describe him as domineering and abusive. Butch, the eldest son, has a reputation for drugs, alcohol, and erratic behavior. At 23, he still lives at home, unemployed, surviving on money funneled to him by his father. Their relationship is strained and explosive. And in the early hours of November 13th, Butch snaps. Armed with his father's .35 caliber Marlin rifle, he moves quietly through the house. One by one, he enters each bedroom. His father is shot first, then his mother. He continues down the hall, shooting his 2 younger brothers, his 2 sisters. By the time his son comes up, 6 members of the DeFeo family are dead. The crime scene is bizarre. All 6 victims are found lying face down in their beds. Not one shows signs of waking or trying to escape. There are no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle. And here's the part that baffles investigators. A rifle like the one Butch used is extremely loud. The shots would have echoed through the house. Yet none of the neighbors reported hearing gunfire that night. Even the DeFeo's dog, a sheepdog named Shaggy, was tied up in the yard, barking, but no one recalls hearing the blasts. It's as if the murders happened in silence. By the next day, suspicion falls on Butch himself. He tries to cover his tracks, rushing into a local bar, shouting that his family has been murdered. Police arrive, but within hours, his story falls apart. His timeline doesn't add up. His alibi crumbles. The rifle is quickly traced back to him. He's arrested. At first, Butch claims the killings were carried out by a mob hitman, trying to deflect suspicion. But investigators aren't buying it. Eventually, he confesses, though his story changes multiple times. In one version, he admits he killed his family in cold blood after years of abuse from his father. In another, he claims his sister Dawn helped him before he turned the gun on her. But the most chilling claim comes later, that voices inside the house told him to do it. During his trial in 1975, his defense attorney pushes an insanity plea, insisting that Butch was driven by forces beyond his control. He claims he heard demonic whispers urging him to kill. The jury doesn't buy it. After 6 weeks of testimony, Ronald DeFeo Jr. is found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life for each count. And yet, the strange, unanswered questions remain. On December 18, 1975, George, Kathy, and the 3 kids, Daniel, 9, Christopher, 7, and little Missy, just 5, unlock the front door and step inside their new home. At first glance, it looks perfect. Big yard, plenty of space, beautiful view of the canal. A dream home. But right away, they sense something's off. From day one, George complains that no matter how high he turns up the thermostat, the house feels icy cold. He chops wood obsessively, trying to keep the fireplace going, but it's never enough. He feels a chill that seems to seep into his bones. And then the nights start. George finds himself waking up at exactly 3:15 a.m. every night. over and over again. That detail doesn't hit him at first, but later, he learns that was the precise time Ronald DeFeo Jr. carried out the murders. Meanwhile, the kids begin acting strange. Kathy notices they're short-tempered, restless, but it's Missy who disturbs her the most. The 5-year-old suddenly has an imaginary friend. She says it's a pig-like creature with glowing red eyes. She calls it Jody. Kathy shrugs it off at first. Kids invent friends all the time, but then she sees something herself. One night, looking out Missy's window, she swears she sees 2 glowing red eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Kathy herself starts to change. She's plagued by vivid nightmares. Night after night, she dreams about the DeFeo murders, seeing them happen in graphic, bloody detail. In some dreams, she even claims she's inside Louise DeFeo's body, watching helplessly as her children are gunned down. Other times, she wakes up shaking, insisting she can feel the presence of the DeFeo family in the house, watching them. The family priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, comes to bless the home not long after they move in. But as he sprinkles holy water in one of the upstairs rooms, he suddenly feels a powerful force pressing down on him. He hears a deep voice growl, "Get out." Shaken, Father Pecoraro warns the Lutzes not to use that room. He tells them the house doesn't feel right. But the Lutzes stay, hoping things will calm down. Instead, they escalate. George grows more and more irritable. He stops shaving, stops going to work. He spends his days stoking the fire, glaring at his family. Kathy claims she sees him transform, his face twisting, his eyes darkening, as if something is taking him over. Doors slam on their own. Windows rattle violently. Strange stenches of sulfur and decay seep through the halls. Swarms of flies suddenly appear in the middle of winter. One night, Kathy says she levitates off the bed. Another time, she wakes up to find deep red welts across her body. For George, the nights are worse. He hears footsteps pacing outside the bedroom door, but when he checks, no one's there. He hears a marching band playing in the living room, but when he runs downstairs, the music stops and the furniture is shoved out of place. The children complain of invisible hands touching them. Crucifixes hung on the walls are found flipped upside down. And always, there are the eyes, those glowing red eyes, watching them from the dark. The dream home on Ocean Avenue has become something else entirely. And for the Lutz family, the nightmare is only just beginning. Doors slam shut violently, even when no one's near them. Windows rattle so hard they seem ready to shatter. And then there's the slime, thick, green goo that oozes from keyholes and seeps down the walls with no explanation. Swarms of flies begin appearing in the middle of winter, buzzing in thick clusters around the upstairs bedrooms. The smell is unbearable, a stench of rot and filth that comes and goes without warning. George Lutz begins to unravel. Normally easygoing, he becomes moody, withdrawn, even hostile. Friends who visit say it's as though the house itself is draining him, feeding on him. He chops firewood compulsively, piling it high, staring into the flames for hours. Kathy catches him muttering under his breath, words she can't make out. Meanwhile, Kathy herself is tormented at night. She wakes to the sensation of invisible hands groping at her, leaving bruises and welts across her body that she cannot explain. One evening, looking into a mirror, she swears she sees a demonic face staring back at her. Twisted, grotesque, nothing human. And then there's Missy. The 5-year-old continues her conversations with Jody, her pig-like, red-eyed friend. Sometimes she giggles at nothing. Other times, she insists Jody doesn't like George. One night, George swears he sees it himself. 2 glowing red eyes outside Missy's window, exactly at the height she claimed Jody stood. The family grows desperate and calls in a priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro. The moment he enters one of the upstairs bedrooms, he feels it, a weight like something pressing down on him. Then, clear as day, he hears a guttural voice hiss from nowhere, "Get out." Frozen in terror, Pecoraro stumbles out of the room, convinced something unseen has just slapped him across the face. Later, he'll admit publicly that what he felt in that house was real and malevolent. But for the Lutz family, the priest's warning isn't enough. They try to endure. They tell themselves it's stress, imagination, maybe even leftover trauma from knowing what happened there. But the house isn't done with them. The worst is still coming. The haunting doesn't let up. For 28 days straight, It's as if the house is alive, attacking them. Furniture levitates in front of their eyes. Crucifixes they've hung on the walls twist violently until they're upside down. Rooms fill with foul, rotting odors that appear and vanish with no source. George and Kathy's relationship begins to buckle under the weight of it all. One night, George wakes to see Kathy floating above the bed. Another time, he swears her face morphs before his eyes, her features sagging, wrinkling, until she looks like an old woman. Seconds later, she's back to normal. The attacks grow stranger. One night, George hears what sounds like an entire marching band, boots stomping, horns blaring, parading through their living room. He races downstairs, heart pounding, only to find the furniture overturned, the room in chaos, but completely empty. The children are suffering too. They wake up screaming almost nightly. Missy cries that Jody won't leave her alone. The boys complain of being pushed, shoved, and scratched by unseen hands. By late January, George and Kathy are at their breaking point. The house is wearing them down, physically and mentally. George grows gaunt, pale, barely eating. Kathy is covered in bruises she can't explain. The kids are hysterical, constantly on edge. Finally, on the night of January 14, 1976, they reach their limit. In the middle of the night, without packing a single bag, they grab the kids, bolt out the door, and speed away from 112 Ocean Avenue. They leave everything behind. Their clothes, their furniture, even their personal belongings. They never return. The Lutz family later describes what happened inside the house as hell on earth. And to this day, nobody has been able to prove exactly what it was they experienced. The Lutz family's nightmare lasts just 28 days, but their story becomes world famous. Not long after they flee the house, they share their experience with two of the most famous paranormal investigators in the world, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens tour the property and immediately declare it one of the most haunted locations they've ever stepped foot in. Lorraine later says the demonic presence inside that house was overwhelming, stronger than almost anything she'd ever encountered. From there, the story explodes. Headlines, documentaries, best-selling books, eventually blockbuster Hollywood movies. The legend of the Amityville Horror is born. And then there's Missy. The 5-year-old continues her conversations with Jody, her pig-like, red-eyed friend. Sometimes she giggles at nothing. Other times, she insists Jody doesn't like George. One night, George swears he sees it himself. Two glowing red eyes outside Missy's window, exactly at the height she claimed Jody stood. The family grows desperate and calls in a priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro. The moment he enters one of the upstairs bedrooms, he feels it, a weight like something pressing down on him. Then, clear as day, he hears a guttural voice hiss from nowhere, "Get out." Frozen in terror, Pecoraro stumbles out of the room, convinced something unseen has just slapped him across the face. Later, he'll admit publicly that what he felt in that house was real and malevolent. But for the Lutz family, the priest's warning isn't enough. They try to endure. They tell themselves it's stress, imagination, maybe even leftover trauma from knowing what happened there. But the house isn't done with them. The worst is still coming. The haunting doesn't let up. For 28 days straight, it's as if the house is alive, attacking them. Furniture levitates in front of their eyes. Crucifixes they've hung on the walls twist violently until they're upside down. Rooms fill with foul, rotting odors that appear and vanish with no source. George and Kathy's relationship begins to buckle under the weight of it all. One night, George wakes to see Kathy floating above the bed. Another time, he swears her face morphs before his eyes, her features sagging, wrinkling, until she looks like an old woman. Seconds later, she's back to normal. The attacks grow stranger. One night, George hears what sounds like an entire marching band, boots stomping, horns blaring, parading through their living room. He races downstairs, heart pounding, only to find the furniture overturned, the room in chaos, but completely empty. The children are suffering too. They wake up screaming almost nightly. Missy cries that Jody won't leave her alone. The boys complain of being pushed, shoved, and scratched by unseen hands. By late January, George and Kathy are at their breaking point. The house is wearing them down, physically and mentally. George grows gaunt, pale, barely eating. Kathy is covered in bruises she can't explain. The kids are hysterical, constantly on edge. Finally, on the night of January 14, 1976, they reached their limit. In the middle of the night, without packing a single bag, they grab the kids, bolt out the door, and speed away from 112 Ocean Avenue. They leave everything behind: their clothes, their furniture, even their personal belongings. They never return. But with the fame comes controversy. Skeptics point out inconsistencies in the Lutz's accounts. Some accuse them of fabricating the entire thing as a way to profit off the DeFeo murders. Even Father Ralph Pecoraro, the priest who blessed the house and famously heard "Get Out," would later downplay certain details. Neighbors insist they never once saw green slime, levitating furniture, or glowing red eyes. And yet, not everything is so easily explained away. Like the murders themselves, 6 members of the DeFeo family, all found face down, all in their beds, with no signs of struggle. Not a single neighbor hearing gunshots from a high-powered rifle. And Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s chilling claim that voices told him to kill. Or the fact that even after the Lutzes left, others who entered the house, including priests, reporters, and paranormal investigators, swore they felt or saw something deeply unnatural inside 112 Ocean Avenue. To this day, the Amityville Horror remains one of the most infamous paranormal cases in American history. For skeptics, it's a hoax, an overblown story that got out of control. For believers, it's proof of something darker, something that can infect a home, twist a mind, and destroy a family. And for the Lutzes, it was 28 days of pure terror in what they thought would be their dream house, but instead became their worst nightmare.
It's the middle of August, 1977. A humid, sticky evening has settled over the quiet, working-class neighbourhood of Enfield, in North London. The sun has dipped below the rooftops, and in the small brick council houses that line Green Street, families are shutting their curtains, settling in for the night. Inside number 284, Green Street, a modest 2-story home, with peeling paint and a cluttered little garden out front, 11-year-old Janet Hodgson sits cross-legged on her bed. Her younger brother, Johnny, just 10 years old, is sprawled out on the other mattress in their upstairs bedroom. Their mother, Peggy Hodgson, a single parent raising 4 children on her own, is downstairs cleaning up after dinner. The house is cramped, noisy, full of sibling bickering and the everyday stress of raising kids on a shoestring budget. There's nothing remarkable about it. Nothing, that is, until that night, because as Janet is talking with Johnny, she suddenly freezes. Knock, knock, knock. At first, it's faint, like the sound of someone gently rapping their knuckles against a wall. Janet glances at her brother. "Did you hear that?" Johnny nods. The sound comes again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. The kids scramble to their feet, pressing their ears to the wall. It sounds like it's coming from inside. Maybe the plumbing, maybe a mouse. But then the knocks travel. They shift from one wall to another, then across the ceiling, like something is crawling just out of sight, surrounding them. The kids scream for their mother. Peggy rushes upstairs, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She listens, her face tight. Then she opens closets, checks under the beds, even presses her hands against the plastic. Nothing. And yet, the knocking doesn't stop. In fact, it intensified. Bang, bang, bang. Peggy's eyes widen. The sound is too loud, too deliberate to be pipes or floorboard. The children cling to her, terrified. And then it happened. Across the room, in plain sight of everyone standing there, a large wooden dresser, so heavy it normally takes 2 grown men to shift it, suddenly jerks forward with a violent scrape. It slides several feet across the carpet, coming to a dead stop against the opposite wall. Peggy's heart nearly stopped. She yells at Janet to push it back. The girl presses her small hands against the wood and shouts with all her strength. The dresser won't budge. It's as if it's been cemented to the floor. And then, right as Peggy reaches down to help, the dresser moves again, on its own. That's it. That's the breaking point. Peggy grabs her kids, races down the stairs, and tears out the front door, her children tumbling after her. They sprint across the narrow street to their neighbors, the Nottinghams, banging frantically on their door. When the neighbors open up, they find the Hodgsons pale, shaking, breathless. Peggy blurts out that something is inside her house. Now, the Nottinghams were no strangers to the Hodgson family's trouble. Everyone on the street knew Peggy was struggling. She had recently separated from her husband, and was doing her best to keep the household together. But this was different. Curious, the neighbors follow Peggy back to 284. Together they creep inside. The house is eerily quiet, the air heavy. And then, like a cruel joke, The knocking starts up again, loud, rhythmic, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The neighbors stand frozen, mouths open. They'd expected to find nothing. Maybe the kids were imagining things. Maybe it was just stress. But now they are standing in the living room, and the sound is echoing all around them. One of the neighbors, Vic Nottingham, shouts out, "All right, knock once for yes, twice for no." The house goes dead silent. Then, bang, a single knock. Everyone bolt. The Hodgsons, their neighbors, and even the kids are now utterly convinced something unnatural has taken up residence inside 284 Green Street. With no other option, Peggy does what any terrified mother in her position would do. She calls the police. Later that night, 2 uniformed officers arrive at the Hodgson home. They take statements, try to calm everyone down, and begin a walkthrough of the property. At first, nothing happened. The officers are polite, but clearly skeptical. Then, in the living room, one officer sits down and watches as a heavy wooden chair suddenly lifts an inch off the ground, then slams back down. No strings, no wires, no explanation. The officer later swears in her official report she saw the chair move entirely on its own. That report becomes one of the earliest pieces of documented evidence in what will go on to be one of the most infamous, terrifying, and hotly debated paranormal cases in history, the Enfield Poltergeist. And for the Hodgsons, that single night was only the opening chapter of an 18-month nightmare. From that night on, the Hodgson house turns into something out of a nightmare. What had started as knocks and one dresser sliding across a room evolves into a relentless campaign of chaos. Furniture begins moving on its own, chairs scraping across the floor with no one near them, tables rocking back and forth as if caught in an invisible storm. The children's toys, normally scattered around the bedroom, become weaponed. Lego bricks, marbles, and building blocks lift into the air and hurl themselves across the room with alarming speed. Some strike the children, some narrowly miss their head. The Hodgsons, already shaken, start noticing something even stranger. The disturbances aren't random. They seem to follow Janet. She becomes the center of the storm. Night after night, her mother hears her scream, only to rush into the bedroom and find Janet tossed from her bed, sometimes landing several feet away. On more than one occasion, the girl is found entangled in curtains, as though something had picked her up and thrown her there. And here's the part that makes this case different from countless other ghost stories. The Hodgsons aren't the only ones seeing it. Neighbors, police officers, even journalists witness things they simply cannot explain. One of the earliest witnesses is WPC Carolyn Heaps, the female police constable who answers Peggy Hodgson's desperate call. She walks into the living room, notebook in hand, and sits down. At first, everything seems calm. She tries to reassure the family, but then, in full view of everyone present, a wooden chair inches forward, lifting slightly off the carpet before dropping back down with a thump.
Heaps later writes in her official police report that she saw it with her own eyes. No wires, no trickery. A police officer, trained to observe and record facts, swearing under oath that furniture in this house was moving by itself. And that's just the beginning. Over the following weeks, visitors pour in, family, friends, neighbors, and eventually the press. Many come expecting to debunk the whole thing, until they see it for themselves. A photographer from the Daily Mirror sets up his camera in Janet's room. As he adjusts his lens, he hears a crash. He spins around, just in time to see a Lego brick lift off the floor and shoot across the room. When it hits him in the forehead, it leaves a visible welt. His hands shake as he tries to load film into the camera. Reporters describe heavy knocks echoing through the walls, drawers opening and slamming shut, and objects hurtling through the air with no visible source. Some visitors flee after just minutes inside, too frightened to stay. The Hodgsons try to carry on with some sense of normal life, but it's impossible. The children are missing school. Peggy is exhausted, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. At night, the entire family sometimes sleeps together in one room, too afraid to be separated. The activity builds in intensity. Janet is often the target. She describes being pulled out of bed by unseen hands, dragged across the floor, and even choked. Onlookers swear they've seen her levitate. Neighbors later testify that they looked through the window one evening and saw Janet hovering several feet above her bed before crashing down. Photographs, taken by journalists with split-second shutters, capture Janet Madare in positions that don't look like jumping. They look like she's been thrown. And the noises never stop. Rhythmic knocking that seems to respond to questions. Heavy bangs that rattle the walls. Even growls and strange voices that echo through the dark hallways, terrifying anyone unlucky enough to hear them. What's most disturbing is that the activity isn't shy. This isn't whispers in the dark. This isn't something lurking in the shadows. This is loud. This is violent. This is in-your-face paranormal chaos. By now, the Hodgson's house has become a spectacle. Skeptics and believers alike are crowding around 284 Green Street, hoping for a glimpse of the impossible. Some leave shaking their heads, dismissing it as hysteria. But others, neighbors, reporters, and even police officers, walk away pale, shaken, muttering under their breath that they've just witnessed something they'll never forget. And at the center of all of it is an exhausted 11-year-old girl, Janet, who insists she doesn't want this attention, doesn't want this fear. She just wants it to stop, but it won't. Not yet, because this haunting isn't finished. It's only just getting started. And then it gets worse. Up until this point, the chaos inside 284 Green Street had been terrifying, but almost predictable. Bangs, moving furniture, objects flying, Janet being tossed around. But nothing prepared the Hodgsons for what happened next. Because one day, completely out of nowhere, Janet begins speaking in a voice that is not her own. Her mother, Peggy, describes it as deep, harsh, gravelly. It doesn't sound like an 11-year-old girl. It sounds like an old man. When investigators ask the voice who it is, the reply sends a chill through the room. "My name is Bill Wilkins," it growls. And then, in detail, this voice describes dying in the living room of that very house, collapsing in a chair from a brain hemorrhage. Peggy stares at her daughter in horror. Her lips are moving, but it doesn't sound like Janet. It doesn't feel like Janet. Her small frame shakes as the guttural words pour out. At first, everyone assumes this must be some sort of trick. Maybe Janet is faking it. Maybe she's learned how to throw her voice. But the things this Bill Wilkins says are disturbingly accurate. The family has never heard of him. But when investigators dig through local records, they confirm that a man named Bill Wilkins did, in fact, die in Hodgson's home, just as the voice claimed. And then comes the real kicker. Bill's own son is eventually contacted. He listens to the details Bill gives through Janet's body. The chair, the hemorrhage, the exact circumstances of his death. Quietly, he confirms it's all true. Investigators are stunned. They decide to put Janet to the test. For hours, they have her speak in the voice. They even stuff her mouth with water and tape to see if she can still produce the sound. She does. Over and over, this guttural growl pours out. Far too loud and far too harsh for her small vocal cords to realistically generate without causing damage. Doctors later examined Janet's throat, expecting to see strain, swelling, or injury from forcing her voice into such a low register. But there's nothing. Her vocal cords are perfectly healthy. One expert remarks, if a normal person attempted to speak like that for even a few minutes, they'd lose their voice. Janet did it for hours. And while the technical impossibility of it all is shocking, what's far more disturbing is the content. Because this voice doesn't just say it's Bill. It mocks the family. It laughs at them. It threatens them. It curses. In one chilling exchange, when asked why he's there, the voice sneers, "Because this is my house." At night, the guttural growls echo through the Hodgsons' bedrooms, keeping everyone awake, keeping them on edge. The children cling to their mother, too afraid to move. Peggy describes lying in bed, tears streaming down her face, listening to her little girl's voice transform into that of a bitter, violent old man who seems to enjoy tormenting them. And just when they think they've gotten used to it, it changes. Because it isn't always Bill speaking. Sometimes there are other voices, multiple entities, each with their own tone, each with their own story. Investigators record tapes of Janet holding conversations back and forth. Her own voice on one side, the guttural, rasping Bill on the other. It sounds like two completely different people arguing. Imagine being in that house, hearing your child, your sibling, your neighbors suddenly start channeling not just one, but multiple distinct personalities, none of which sound humanly possible for her to produce. The effect on the family is devastating. Janet herself says she feels like she's being taken over, like something is pushing its way out of her. Sometimes she claims she can't breathe when the voice comes. Other times she blacks out, with no memory of what she said while Bill was in control. The investigators felt fascinated admit it's one of the most disturbing things they've ever encountered. They record dozens of hours of tapes, evidence that is still studied and debated to this day. And what's most terrifying isn't just the voice itself. It's the way it behaves. It doesn't simply identify itself and leave. It taunts, it threatens, it enjoys scaring them, as if whatever is inside that house isn't just haunting the Hodgsons, it's playing with them. The case doesn't stay confined to Green Street for long. Word spreads quickly. Neighbors talk. Local papers pick it up. And before long, reporters, photographers, and eventually television crews are knocking at the Hodgsons' front door. This strange little council house in Enfield is suddenly the focus of national attention. The story eventually reaches the Society for Psychical Research, one of Britain's most prominent organizations dedicated to investigating the paranormal. And two of their members, Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, decide to see for themselves what's really happening inside 284 Green Street. At first, they think they'll stay for a few nights, collect some data, write up a report. But what they find is so disturbing that they don't just visit. They move in. For the better part of a year, Grosse and Playfair practically live with the Hodgsons, documenting every strange occurrence, day and night. They bring tape recorders, cameras, notebooks, and an unshakable determination to get to the bottom of this. And they're not disappointed. On countless occasions, they hear the loud, rhythmic knocking themselves, sometimes so forceful the walls shake. They record toys flying through the air with enough speed to bruise whoever they hit. They capture furniture sliding, doors slamming, and even heavy objects being overturned while no one is near them. And then there's Janet. Grosse and Playfair witness her thrown from her bed, sometimes across the room. They describe her going into violent trances, her body contorting unnaturally, her voice transforming into that of the infamous Bill Wilkins. On one occasion, a photographer snaps a series of images in rapid succession. The resulting photos show Janet suspended midair in her bedroom, her body bent backward, her face twisted in fear. To this day, skeptics argue she was simply jumping off a bed, but others insist the angle of her body, the sheer height she appears to have reached, suggests she was launched. The investigators also collect dozens of hours of audio tapes, filled with the guttural voices that seem to pour out of Janet. They test her again and again to try to rule out ventriloquism or trickery. The more they test, the more baffled they become. But not everyone is convinced. As the media circus grows, so does the skepticism. Some neighbors whisper that Janet is just a clever, attention-seeking child. Others point out that the activity seems to spike when cameras are around. Even some journalists who witness strange things can't help but suspect trickery. After all, Janet and her sister Margaret do admit, years later, that they sometimes faked small incidents like bending spoons or knocking on walls, just to see how far they could push the investigators. But Grosse and Playfair aren't so easily swayed. Maurice Grosse, in particular, becomes deeply invested in the case. His own daughter had died in a tragic motorcycle accident just a year earlier, and some suggest that his grief made him more open to believing in life after death. But regardless of his motivation, Grosse insists that the vast majority of what he and Playfair witnessed simply could not have been faked. He's quoted saying, "I was no longer the impartial investigator. I was part of the family, and I was determined to protect them." For months, the two men endure sleepless nights in that house. They listen to the knocks, they dodge flying objects, they interview the children, and they scribble down page after page of notes. By the end, their files contain hundreds of hours of recordings, photographs, and detailed logs of phenomena. It's one of the most extensively documented hauntings in history. But even with all that evidence, the case divides opinion. To believers, Grosse and Playfair are heroes who exposed one of the most genuine cases of poltergeist activity ever recorded. To skeptics, they're gullible men taken in by clever children and a desperate family. Meanwhile, inside the Hodgson household, none of that matters. The family's exhausted. Peggy looks years older, worn down from endless nights of chaos and fear. The children are missing school, their grades slipping. Janet is both the star witness and the main victim. Increasingly isolated, her body battered and her mind fraying under the pressure. They don't care about the cameras. They don't care about the debates. They don't care about who believes and who doesn't. All they want is for it to stop. But the thing inside 284 Green Street isn't finished yet. The haunting drags on for nearly a year and a half. For 18 long months, the Hodgson family endures a cycle of terror. Sometimes the house falls quiet, almost normal. Weeks pass with barely a knock or a whisper, and the family dares to hope it's finally over. But then, just as they let their guard down, the activity surges back with brutal force. Objects flying, Janet's voice twisting into Bill Wilkins, the guttural growls echoing through the night. It wears them down. Peggy Hodgson becomes thin, tired, her face lined with stress. Her children struggle in school, exhausted from sleepless nights. Friends stop visiting. Even neighbors, who once gathered to witness the chaos, begin avoiding the house, afraid to get caught up in it. The investigators stay as long as they can. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair remain deeply involved, logging hundreds of incidents, filling entire notebooks with details. But eventually, as the months stretch on, even they begin to fade in and out, visiting less often, leaving the family to cope on their own. And then it happens. The storm begins to lose its power. The violent episodes grow fewer, the guttural voices fade, and the knocks soften into silence. By the summer of 1979, almost 2 years after that first dresser slid across Janet's bedroom, the activity seems to have stopped. For the Hodgsons, the end isn't dramatic. There's no priest casting something out, no final terrifying showdown. The house just goes quiet. Life resumes, but it's never the same. Janet grows older, finishes school, and eventually leaves Green Street. She gets married, has children, and tries to build a normal life. But in interviews decades later, she admits she never fully escaped what happened in that house. She talks about being bullied at school, called the ghost girl, mocked by classmates who'd seen her face in newspapers. And she admits there are whole stretches of time from that period she doesn't remember, blank spaces in her memory that she attributes to trauma. Years later, Janet and her sister Margaret come forward with a confession. They admit that, yes, they did fake some incidents. Sometimes they would bend spoons or knock on walls, just to test the investigators or to get attention when the real activity went quiet. But they both insist the vast majority of what happened was real. And here's the part that makes the case so infamous. Even if you discount the sisters' tricks, dozens of independent witnesses, including police officers, neighbors, reporters, and professional investigators, still swore they saw things that simply cannot be explained. That's why, to this day, the Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most well-documented hauntings in history. More than 30 people outside the family claim to have experienced something firsthand. Hundreds of hours of audio tapes, photographs, and written reports survive, making it one of the most studied cases of alleged poltergeist activity ever recorded. The case has inspired countless books, TV specials, and documentaries. Hollywood even turned it into blockbuster horror, most famously dramatized in The Conjuring 2. But behind the movies and headlines for the Hodgsons, it wasn't entertainment. It was real, it was raw, and it was terrifying. For 18 months, their small council house on Green Street was transformed into something unrecognizable, a place of chaos, a place of fear. And even after the voices stopped, even after the furniture stayed still, even after Janet grew up and moved away, the house never truly felt like home. It's the late 1800s in the quiet little village of Borley, Essex. On a lonely stretch of land, just beyond the churchyard, stand the towering red brick mansion, Borley Rectory. Built in 1862, the house was commissioned by Reverend Henry Dawson Ellisbold, the local rector. With its 23 rooms, long corridors, and looming almost fortress-like walls, it was meant to be a grand family home. But even before the Bulls moved in, there were whispers. Builders complained of strange sensations while laying the foundations. Some claimed they saw shadows moving across unfinished walls when no one was inside. Others refused to work after tools went missing or bricks were found stacked neatly in places no one remembered putting them. When the house was finally completed, the locals in Borley didn't see it as a proud new landmark. They saw it as ominous. Almost instantly, rumors began circulating. And at the center of those rumors was the nun. According to village legend, centuries earlier, a young nun from a nearby convent had fallen in love with a monk from the local monastery. Against all vows, the two planned to run away together, starting a new life in secret. But before they could escape, they were discovered. The punishment was brutal. The monk was executed, and the nun, depending on which version of the story you heard, was either strangled to death or bricked alive inside the walls of the convent. Locals believed her spirit never left. And when the rectory was built on the old monastery grounds, her ghost returned, forever searching for the lover she'd lost. Not long after Reverend Bull, his wife, and their 14 children moved in, the sightings began. One of the most chilling reports came from the garden path that ran alongside the house. Servants and villagers described seeing a figure in a nun's habit gliding silently along the path in broad daylight, only to vanish before their eyes. The apparition was seen so often that the Bulls gave it a name, the Nun's Walk. The Bull children even began daring each other to go outside and try to talk to her. Some swore they heard faint whispers in response. Others said she looked at them, face pale and sorrowful, before fading away like smoke. Reverend Henry Bull himself became oddly fascinated with the ghost. Instead of fearing it, he leaned into the legend. In fact, he built a summer house facing the garden path, just so his family could watch the nun drift past whenever she appeared. But the nun wasn't the only ghostly presence. Inside the house, the Bulls experienced constant disturbances. Unexplained footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Doors slammed shut by themselves. Objects went missing and later turned up in odd places. Visitors described feeling sudden blasts of icy cold air in rooms with no open windows. Some claimed they heard their own names whispered in the dark. The family's servants were especially affected. Several resigned, insisting they couldn't stay in a place that felt alive with spirits. Guests often cut their visits short, leaving in the middle of the night after hearing knocks on their bedroom doors, only to open them and find no one there. The longer the Bulls stayed, the more the rectory's reputation grew. To the villagers of Borley, it wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place you avoided at all costs. When Reverend Henry Bull died in 1892, his son Harry Bull inherited the rectory. But if the family hoped the activity would die with Henry, they were wrong. Under Harry's time, the hauntings only escalated. Harry himself often told visitors about seeing the nun. Servants continued to quit, and by this point, villagers had started reporting their own sightings near the property. Strange lights in the windows when the house was empty, or the sound of a coach rumbling down the road at night, drawn by ghostly horses that never appeared. For decades, Borley Rectory was plagued by these events. To outsiders, it was simply the most haunted house in England. But for the Bull family, it was home. A home they could never truly relax in. A home where the walls themselves seemed to whisper. And deep down, the villagers believed one thing. That nun, whoever she was still out there, restless, walking the grounds of Borley Rectory in eternal sorrow. And this was just the beginning. The Bulls hear it almost constantly. Unexplained knocks echoing through the halls, like someone rapping on the walls just beyond reach. Heavy phantom footsteps climbing the stairs when no one is there. Doors slamming shut in empty rooms, as though the house itself were breathing and moving around them. But for the family, the most terrifying presence isn't the noises. It's her. The story that circulates through Borley is one of doomed love. Centuries earlier, a nun from a nearby convent had fallen in love with a monk from the local monastery. Desperate to be together, they planned to elope under the cover of darkness, but they never made it. The monk was caught and swiftly executed, and the nun, depending on which villager told the story, was either strangled to death or, more horrifically, sealed alive inside the cold stone walls of her convent as punishment. Her spirit, the locals whisper, never moved on. Instead, it lingered tied to the ground where Borley Rectory now stood. And the Bull family insists they see her again and again. The children are the first to speak of her. They claim they see the figure of a woman dressed in a nun's habit, drifting silently along the garden path, her head bowed, her face pale and sorrowful. She appears in both broad daylight and pitch darkness. Sometimes she vanishes into thin air. Sometimes she simply melts back into the walls of the house. At first, the family tries to ignore it, but the sightings are too frequent. Servants begin whispering about her, refusing to step outside at night. Visitors describe watching her appear at the edge of the garden, only to dissolve as they drew closer. Instead of denying it, Reverend Henry Bull does something strange. He builds a small summer house facing the garden path, just so the family can watch her more comfortably. To him, the apparition isn't just a ghost. It's a kind of household curiosity. For years, he refers to her as our nun. But to the locals of Borley, it's anything but quaint. They see her as a bad omen, a restless soul tethered to tragedy. When Reverend Henry Bull dies in 1892, his son Reverend Harry Bull inherits the rectory. If the family hopes the strange events might fade, they're quickly disappointed. The ghostly nun continues to appear just as often as before. The knocks and footsteps grow louder. Doors open and close violently, as if someone unseen is pacing the house in frustration. The longer the Bulls remain, the more oppressive the atmosphere becomes. Servants quit in fear, some refusing to even pack their belongings, leaving in the middle of the night. Guests invited to stay the night often leave before morning, pale and shaken, muttering about footsteps in their rooms and hands tugging at their blankets while they slept. By the turn of the century, Borley Rectory is no longer just a grand house with eccentric stories. It has become notorious. Villagers begin crossing the street to avoid it. Children dare each other to run up to its gate at night and touch the door before sprinting away in terror. And for the Bulls themselves, what began as whispers and shadows has turned into a constant, suffocating reminder that something or someone is sharing their home. Borley Rectory has gone from a place of comfort to a place most people won't even step foot in. By the late 1920s, Borley Rectory's reputation is well known across Essex. Locals whisper about its ghosts, and few dare to even glance at the house after sunset. But in 1928, the church assigns a new family to live there, Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife, Mabel. For them, the rectory seems like a fine posting at first, a sprawling home, a place to serve their parish, and, perhaps most importantly, a chance to start fresh. But almost immediately, the Smiths realize something is wrong. They hear whispers in the hallways when no one else is in the house. Doors creak open in the dead of night. Footsteps echo through the corridors, and objects vanish from one room only to turn up later in impossible places. At first, the couple dismisses it as their imagination, or perhaps tricks of the drafty old building. But then comes the moment that changes everything. One afternoon, while cleaning, Mabel Smith discovers a brown paper bag tucked into the back of a cupboard. Inside it is a human skull. Its eye sockets are empty, its jaw slightly ajar, as if frozen mid-scream. Shocked, she immediately contacts her husband. The Smiths bury the skull in the churchyard, hoping it will finally put the disturbances to rest. It doesn't. Instead, the activity intensifies. Bells in the house begin to ring on their own, even when the wires are cut. Small stones rain down inside rooms, pelting floors and furniture as though thrown by invisible hands. Windows shatter with no explanation. Mabel confides in neighbors that she hears faint voices whispering her name at night. The couple grows desperate. In their search for answers, they reach out to the Daily Mirror newspaper, hoping that publicity might draw attention to their plight. The paper, in turn, contacts Harry Price. At the time, Price is one of the most famous paranormal investigators in Britain. Charismatic, theatrical, and utterly fascinated by the supernatural, he jumps at the chance to explore Borley Rectory. In June 1929, Price arrives with cameras, notebooks, and a team of researchers. From the moment he sets foot inside, he claims the house is alive with activity. Within days, he reports seeing objects flying across rooms without anyone touching them. Stones and fragments of brick appear out of thin air and strike the walls. Bells ring violently despite being disconnected from power. Shadows flit across the halls, and strange cold drafts sweep through rooms with no open windows. One of Price's assistants even swears that, late one night, he saw the figure of a woman in black, head bowed, hands clasped, gliding silently across the garden path before vanishing into darkness. Price is convinced Borley Rectory isn't just haunted. It might be the most haunted house in all of England. He publishes articles about the case, and almost overnight, the rectory becomes a sensation. The press dubs it the most haunted house in England. Paranormal enthusiasts flock to the village. Locals, who already avoided the place, now whisper that something even darker has been stirred up. But for the Smiths, the attention is too much. Terrified and exhausted, they resign their post and move away, leaving the rectory and its restless spirits behind. After the Smiths flee Borley Rectory in 1929, the The house sits empty for a short time, but the church isn't ready to abandon it yet. A new family is sent to take over the property. Reverend Lionel Foister, his young wife Mary Ann, and their adopted daughter, Adelaide. From the moment they arrive in 1930, it's clear the stories about the rectory aren't exaggerations. If anything, they've been understated. For the Foisters, the haunting is relentless. Windows shatter for no reason. Dishes leap off shelves and crash to the floor. Furniture overturns without warning. Doors lock themselves from the inside, trapping the family in rooms. At night, Reverend Lionel is reportedly thrown from his bed by unseen hands, while Mary Ann is shaken awake by violent knocks that seem to come from inside the walls. But the most chilling events all revolve around Mary Ann. It begins with whispers. She hears her name being called in the corridors, soft and breathless, as though someone is right behind her. Soon after, she starts to feel hands on her, grabbing, tugging, dragging her across rooms. She claims she's slapped, scratched, even hurled to the floor. And then the writing starts. On walls, mirrors, scraps of paper. Messages begin appearing, written in a strange, shaky hand. Investigators who visit the rectory swear they see the letters forming in real time, as if carved into the plaster by invisible fingers. The words are always addressed to Mary Ann. Mary Ann, please help me. Mary Ann, get help. Mary Ann, light mass prayers. To the family, it seems as if some desperate spirit is trying to reach her specifically, pleading with her to intervene, or perhaps warning her. But others suspect something darker. Lionel's journals note that some of the messages shift in tone, growing threatening and cryptic, as though the entity is toying with them. During these years, Lionel begins keeping detailed records of the disturbances, hundreds of incidents over a span of 5 years. His notes include descriptions of objects being hurled across rooms, the sound of ghostly footsteps pacing in the halls, and even phantom voices reciting prayers in Latin. Mary Ann, exhausted and traumatized, confides to friends that she feels the house is targeting her personally. She admits she once saw the figure of a nun standing at the foot of a bed, head bowed, hands clasped as though in prayer, but her face frozen in grief. Some neighbors start whispering that Mary Ann herself is cursed. Others suggest the house has latched onto her, feeding on her fear. By 1935, the family can't take it anymore. Mary Ann's health is failing. Lionel's ministry is collapsing under the weight of gossip and scandal. Their daughter is terrified to stay in her own room. When they finally pack their belongings and leave, they don't look back. By this point, Borley Rectory's reputation isn't just of a haunted house. It's of a place poisoned by something beyond comprehension. A place where even faith, prayer, and reason have no effect. For the Foisters, it had been 5 years of unrelenting terror. For the rest of England, Borley Rectory is no longer just a story whispered among locals. Thanks to Lionel's journals and Harry Price's ongoing investigations, it has become notorious as the most haunted house in England. By the late 1930s, Borley Rectory is no longer a home. It's a carcass of a building, abandoned, decaying, its garden overgrown. Windows gape like dark, watching eyes. Locals cross the road rather than walk past it. Children dare each other just to touch its brick walls. But for Harry Price, the paranormal investigator who first declared Borley the most haunted house in England, this is unfinished business. In 1937, he takes the extraordinary step of renting the rectory for an entire year. His plan is ambitious: to conduct the most comprehensive paranormal investigation England has ever seen. He recruits nearly 50 volunteers, made up of students, researchers, and fellow investigators. Each is given a notebook, strict instructions, and rotating schedules to spend nights inside the house documenting everything they witness. And almost immediately, the activity begins again. Volunteers report phantom footsteps echoing through the corridors. Objects move without explanation. Sudden cold spots chill the air, even in the middle of summer. Several swear they see strange lights flickering in the upstairs windows when no one is inside. One man records the sound of a woman sobbing, though the house is empty. Perhaps the most unnerving sighting comes from a group who claimed they saw a hooded figure drifting silently across the hallways, vanishing before their eyes. Others described the ghostly nun appearing in the garden, standing motionless before gliding out of sight. Price gathers all these reports, convinced Borley Rectory is exactly what he has always claimed: the most haunted house in the country. But then, on February 27, 1939, disaster strikes. A fire breaks out inside the rectory. Accounts vary, but many believe it started in the kitchen after a lamp was knocked over. By the time fire crews arrive, the blaze is unstoppable. Villagers gather at a distance, watching as flames consume the house that had terrified them for decades. And it's here, among the crackling timbers and roaring inferno, that Borley Rectory delivers its most chilling final act. Several onlookers later swear they saw a figure moving through the flames, a woman in black, gliding calmly from room to room. Some insist it was the nun, her face glowing in the firelight, before vanishing into the night. Within hours, Borley Rectory is reduced to a charred ruin. Only jagged walls remain standing, silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. The fire might have been the end of Borley's haunting, but it wasn't. In the aftermath, bones were reportedly discovered buried in the cellar. The remains appeared to belong to a young woman. At the time, many believed this was proof of the old legend. The nun who had been bricked alive centuries earlier, her spirit trapped until the house itself was destroyed. The bones were given a Christian burial, though reports differ as to whether this brought peace or stirred things further. Some locals swore the sightings of the nun actually increased after the fire, now drifting among the ruins instead of the rectory homes. To this day, the site of Borley Rectory remains infamous. Skeptics argue that Harry Price exaggerated or even staged much of the evidence to make headlines. Price himself was a controversial figure, accused more than once of trickery in other investigations. But for believers, the sheer volume of accounts, the hundreds of reports spanning decades, from priests to villagers to investigators, are simply too consistent, too terrifying to dismiss. And so Borley Rectory holds its title, not just as a burned ruin in a quiet English village, but as a story etched into paranormal history. For some, it was a hoax. For others, it was a tragedy. But for those who lived there, the Bulls, the Smiths, the Foysters, it was something far worse. A haunting so relentless that even fire couldn't silence it.
The first thing Sigmund Adam noticed was the phone bill. He was a lawyer in the Bavarian town of Rosenheim, a quiet and orderly place nestled in the foothills of the Alps in southern Germany. His law office sat on Max Joseph's Platz, the kind of place where things ran on a schedule. Appointments kept, papers filed, phones answered. Sigmund was a careful man. So when the telephone company's invoice arrived in the autumn of 1967, and the charges were enormous, he didn't shrug it off. He sat down and went through every line of it. The bill was full of calls to something called a talking clock. In Germany at that time, you could dial a number and a recorded voice would read you the exact time down to the second. People called it occasionally, maybe when they needed to set a watch. Nobody called it hundreds of times in a single month. And yet, according to the invoice, somebody in Sigmund's office had been dialing that number over and over again throughout every single working day. When he asked his staff about it, each one of them said the same thing. They hadn't made those calls. He contacted the phone company and asked them to send a technician. The technician came, inspected every line in the building, and left without finding anything wrong. A few weeks later, the next bill arrived. Same pattern. Dozens of calls to the talking clock every workday, clustering together during office hours, sometimes at a rate that seemed physically impossible. To dial a rotary phone, wait for a connection, and disconnect takes a minimum amount of time. The record showed calls being placed faster than a human hand could manage. In one 15-minute window, the clock service had been contacted 46 times. Sigmund had all four of the office phones replaced with brand new units. The calls continued. By October 1967, the situation had moved past strange invoices into something nobody in that building had any real language for. The lights began going wrong. Neon ceiling fixtures started flickering on and off without any electrical explanation. Then some of them began to swing, not slightly, the way a light might sway if someone bumped the wall. They swung back and forth steadily, like a pendulum, as though something deliberate was moving them. On one particular morning, every light bulb in the office blew out at the same moment with a sound that brought staff rushing into the hallway. No surge had been recorded on any meter. No fuse had blown. The bulbs were simply dead. Sigmund called the electric company. Engineers arrived, installed monitoring equipment throughout the building, and checked every circuit. They found evidence of power surges but could identify no source for them. They replaced sections of wiring. The surges continued. The lights kept failing. The office photocopier began leaking its developing fluid with no mechanical cause anyone could find. Sigmund went further and connected the entire office to a standalone generator, cutting it off completely from the town's power grid. The lights swung anyway. His staff were frightened. Some took personal days. Others arrived each morning and sat at their desks with their coats still on, watching the ceiling and saying very little. Nobody yet had any idea that the explanation for all of it was sitting right there among them, coming to work every single day, answering correspondence, and trying very hard to hold herself together. Her name was Anna Marie Shabel. She was 19 years old, one of the youngest people working at the firm, and by every account, a quiet and reserved young woman who kept mostly to herself. She had recently ended an engagement. The relationship had collapsed in a way that left her shaken, and on top of that, she was deeply unhappy in her job. The kind of quiet unhappiness that settles into a person's bones and never quite lifts. Nobody at the office knew the full weight of what she was carrying. She didn't talk about it. The strange events had been building for weeks before anyone noticed the pattern. It was about timing, the flickering lights, the swinging fixtures, the inexplicable phone records. They happened during office hours. More specifically, they happened on the days Anna Marie came to work. When she took a day off, the building was still. When she returned, the disturbances resumed within hours. Nobody had mapped this yet because nobody was looking for it. They were all still trying to find loose wiring. That changed in December 1967 when two physicists arrived from the Max Planck Institute. Their names were Friedrich Karger and Gerhard Zitscher. They came not as believers but as scientists tasked with finding a rational physical explanation. They installed cameras throughout the office, monitored electrical fields, measured current flow, and documented every incident they witnessed firsthand. They witnessed many. What the cameras captured was difficult to explain away. The moment Anna Marie walked down the hallway, the light fixtures above her began to move. Not when she was standing still beneath her, not when she was in an adjacent room. The moment she moved, they moved with her. The physicists observed this repeatedly and could find no mechanism to account for it. A frame painting on the wall rotated on its hook. A heavy filing cabinet shifted across the floor with nobody near it. On one occasion, a large storage cabinet estimated to weigh around 200 kilograms moved several feet away from the wall it had been sitting against, without leaving a single mark on the linoleum floor beneath it. Karger and Zitscher wrote up their findings with measured scientific language. They stated that some form of energy appeared to be operating in that office that did not correspond to any known physical source. They did not call it supernatural. What they would not say was that they had found a conventional explanation, because they had not found one. Around the same time, a parapsychologist named Hans Bender arrived from the University of Freiburg. Bender was the director of the Institute for Border Areas of Psychology and Mental Hygiene, one of the most respected researchers in this field in all of Europe. He had investigated many strange cases over the course of his career. He had not seen one documented quite like this. He began interviewing the staff individually and within a short time had identified the same pattern the cameras had already recorded. The phenomena orbited Anna Marie. When she left the room, activity dropped. When she came back, it started again. Bender sat with her over several conversations and learned about the broken engagement, the unhappiness at work, the emotional weight she had been quietly carrying for months. He formed a theory. He had encountered versions of it before in his research, though never with this level of documentation behind it. He believed that Anna Marie was not consciously doing anything. He believed she had no awareness of what was happening, but he also believed that the distress she was suppressing was somehow translating into physical force in the environment around her. that the law office had become the stage for something the scientific world had never agreed on a name for. He used the clinical term focal agent. He meant it not as an accusation, but as a description. Anna Marie denied any special abilities. She said so on camera. She was not performing innocence. She genuinely did not understand what was happening any more than anyone else in that building did. By December of 1967, what had started as a confusing phone bill had turned into something drawing national media attention across Germany. The public broadcaster ARD ran a segment on what journalists were calling the scoop on Rosenheim, roughly, the haunting of Rosenheim. Letters arrived at the law office from across the country. Ghost hunters wrote in with theories. Exorcists offered their services. Sigmund Adam had not asked for any of this. He had asked the telephone company to fix his invoice. Inside the office, the disturbances continued to escalate. Calendar pages tore from the wall on their own. Desk drawers opened without anyone near them. Doors slammed shut in empty hallways. More paintings rotated on their hooks, some turning by significant degrees. All of it captured on the cameras Karger and Zicker had installed. Anna Marie, visibly distressed by both the media coverage and the scientific scrutiny she was now under, kept coming to work. On several occasions, she screamed and left the room when objects moved suddenly near her. Every witness who recorded these moments noted consistently that her reaction appeared to be genuine fear, not theater. Bender documented more than 40 eyewitnesses who had seen the disturbances with their own eyes. This was not a case resting on a single person's word. Police officers had been present. Journalists had stood in that hallway and watched the light fixtures swing. Engineers from the electrical company had confirmed the building's wiring was sound and then watched the lights move anyway. The skeptics were not quiet, and they deserved to be heard. A Dutch investigator named Piet Hein Hovens later pointed out that Bender's published accounts left out at least one important detail. A police officer present during the investigation reported observing Anna Marie in what appeared to be an act of deliberate deception, pushing or manipulating an object herself when she thought she wasn't being watched. Bender did not include this observation in his formal report. He also did not include the assessment of a stage magician named Allen who visited the office and suggested that some of what was being presented as spontaneous could be achieved through misdirection and sleight of hand. These omissions matter, but they do not explain the 200-kilogram cabinet that moved across undamaged flooring. They do not explain the electrical surges that continued during the generator test. They do not explain the 46 calls to the talking clock placed within 15 minutes through phones that had already been replaced twice. And they do not account for what two formerly credentialed physicists described in a published scientific paper as an unknown form of energy for which they could find no origin. The truth of what happened in that office almost certainly lives in the complicated territory between those two things. A troubled young woman who may have consciously contributed to some portion of what occurred, and a surrounding pattern of disturbances that nobody with access to every piece of evidence gathered has ever fully and cleanly explained. In January 1968, Anna Marie Schabel left the firm. She didn't make a formal announcement. She simply stopped coming in. The office went quiet, not as a figure of speech. The lights stopped swinging. The phone stopped generating unexplained charges. The cabinet stayed exactly where it was. No drawers opened. No paintings turned on their hooks. The building that had been in a state of chaos for the better part of 4 months became exactly what it had always looked like from the street, a normal law office in a Bavarian town. Hans Bender recorded this in his notes with the same measured neutrality he had brought to every other observation. The correlation, he wrote, was striking. He did not present it as proof of anything. He noted that the disturbances and the person had arrived in that office together and had departed together, and that this fact deserved to be part of any honest analysis of the case. What happened to Anna Marie afterward is a smaller and quieter story, but it adds something. She found employment at other workplaces. By several accounts, low-level electrical disturbances followed her to at least two of them. Equipment malfunctioning, lights behaving erratically, nothing approaching the scale of what had been recorded at the law firm, but consistent enough that people around her noticed. There is one account, widely repeated though not fully documented, that during a social outing at a bowling alley with her new fiance, the electronic scoreboard began malfunctioning in ways that unnerved him deeply enough that he ended the relationship over it. She married in 1969. By all available accounts, after her marriage, the disturbances stopped entirely. Whatever had been happening around her, whether radiating from her or generated by something connected to her, appeared to have resolved when her personal circumstances settled. Hans Bender spent years going back to this case, writing about it, defending it, picking it apart, and putting it back together again. The paper Karga and Zisha published never stopped being cited. The case never stopped being argued over, and it never got resolved. It still hasn't. Sigmund Adam went back to practicing law. The phone bills returned to normal. The lights stayed still. There is something this case keeps doing to people who study it seriously, and it is this. The longer you sit with the full record, the harder it becomes to land comfortably on either side. The skeptical explanation requires Anna Marie Schabeler to have been a sophisticated and sustained deceiver, coordinated enough to fool physicists, police officers, journalists, and a professional stage magician at the same time, across several months, inside a building she had no control over. The one moment of apparent deception observed by the police officer is real and cannot be dismissed. But a single act of misdirection does not move a 200-kilogram cabinet across an undamaged floor. The paranormal explanation requires you to accept that human emotional distress can convert itself into measurable kinetic force, strong enough to rearrange furniture, overload electrical systems, and place telephone calls through a rotary dial faster than human hands are capable of moving. That a 19-year-old secretary from Bavaria was unknowingly reaching out and physically reshaping the world around her. Neither of those sits easily. Neither is complete. What remains is a paper trail, a formally published scientific report, witness statements from more than 40 people, film footage, electrical monitoring data, phone company records, all of it pointing at the same building, the same period, and the same young woman at the center of it. She came to work, and strange things happened. She walked out the door for the last time, and they stopped. That is the Rosenheim Poltergeist. And next, we're going to a small town in Wisconsin in 1987, where a family bought a secondhand garage sale item that they absolutely should have left on the lawn. The next case we're going to talk about didn't attract physicists. It attracted a pastor, police chief, and eventually the producers of one of the most watched television programs in America. And it started with a piece of furniture that a young family in Wisconsin paid $100 for at a secondhand shop. Alan and Debbie Tallman were a working class couple living on Larrabee Street in Horicon, Wisconsin, a small farming town of around 3,800 people set about 40 miles north of Madison. They had moved into the house in November of 1986 with their children, a young boy and a baby girl. Debbie was pregnant with their second daughter when they arrived. Alan worked shifts at a local manufacturing plant, often coming home late at night. Debbie managed the house and the children. By every account, they were a normal family, church-going, private, and completely uninterested in anything to do with the paranormal. The house was a modest single-story ranch on a quiet residential block. To Debbie, it felt like a dream home. She said so to anyone who asked. She expected they would be there for a long time. In February of 1987, Alan and Debbie bought a set of secondhand bunk beds from a thrift shop for $100. The beds were solid and sturdy and looked like nothing at all. They were meant for the girls' room. Alan carried them in and assembled them in the basement first, planning to move them upstairs once the room was ready. A few days after the beds came into the house, the children began getting sick. The Tolmans noted this as unusual because the kids had been healthy for as long as they could remember. They put it down to the season and waited for it to pass. It passed, but something else began. Kenny, the 7-year-old, came to his parents one evening and told them that the dial on his clock radio had moved on its own. He had been watching it when it happened, Alan and Debbie exchanged a look and told him it was probably just the radio searching for a signal. A few nights later, their younger daughter told them she had seen a woman in her room, an ugly old woman with long dark hair and a glow around her that looked like fire. The child was very young and Debbie assumed she had been dreaming. Then Kenny, who had not been told anything about his sister's account, came to them with the same description, the same woman, the same fire. He said he had seen her standing over him in the dark. Alan and Debbie did not know what to do with that. So for a while, they did nothing. They watched, they waited, and the house on Larrabee Street got quieter and stranger and heavier with each week that passed. By the time the bunk beds were moved upstairs into the girls' room in May of 1987, the disturbances had already been building for months. A chair in the living room that slid across the floor on its own, doors opening and closing in empty hallways. A babysitter who had been watching the children one evening came to Debbie and Alan when they got home and told them, visibly shaken, that their son had seen the chair move by itself and that she had not known what to say to him. The tension inside the house had a quality to it that was hard to name. Visitors noticed it. A family cat that the Talmans brought into the home began behaving strangely, climbing the doors and howling every evening at sunset. They eventually had to give the animal away. What nobody yet understood was that moving the beds upstairs appeared to change something. The activity that had been low and occasional began to accelerate. Debbie started hearing her youngest daughter talking in the night. At first, she assumed the child was playing with toys or talking in her sleep, but the conversations became longer and more agitated. The little girl started waking from nightmares and running into her parents' room. She told them about sounds she was hearing that she thought her parents could hear too. She kept asking, "Don't you hear it?" And neither Alan nor Debbie could hear anything at all. As the summer moved into autumn, restless nights became the pattern for the whole family. The feeling inside the house at night was different from anything any of them could articulate. Something oppressive that arrived when the sun went down and settled over the rooms like a weight. Alan started noticing his own mood shifting. He became irritable in ways that weren't like him. He found objects out of place in rooms he knew had been empty. One morning he discovered that a basement window had been moved to the floor with no explanation anyone could offer. In the autumn of 1987, the family contacted their pastor, Reverend Wayne Dobrak. Dobras came to the house, walked through it, prayed, and told the family with quiet certainty that whatever was happening in that home, he believed it had the character of something demonic. He urged them to attend church, to pray daily, and to sing hymns in the house. The Talmans did everything he told them to do. The activity continued without interruption. Then, a week before Christmas 1987, their son was sleeping on the living room couch when he woke in the night to find a figure standing over him. He screamed. Alan came running and found his son in a state of terror that shook him deeply. That was the night Alan Tallman stopped waiting. He stood in the middle of his living room and shouted at whatever was in his house. He challenged it to leave his family alone. He said if it wanted someone, it could come for him instead. It would take a few weeks for that challenge to be answered, and when it was answered, Alan would wish he had stayed quiet. Alan came home from a late shift in the early hours of January 1988. The street was quiet, and the Wisconsin winter had settled hard over Larrabee Street. He pulled into the driveway, stepped out of his car, and walked toward the front door. That was when he heard the voice. It came from the direction of the garage. He stopped walking. The voice said two words, "Come here." Alan stood still for a moment and then turned and walked toward the garage. He came around to the front of it and looked through the windows of the overhead door. What he saw inside stopped him completely. The garage was filled with an orange and red glow, as though it was burning from the inside, and staring back at him through the glass were two eyes floating in the fire. He stood at that window and then the glow was simply gone. He looked again and the garage was dark and still and completely empty. Alan went inside the house. He set his lunchbox down on the kitchen floor. He stood there for a moment trying to steady himself, and then he reached down to pick the lunchbox back up. It left his hand on his own and flew hard across the kitchen and hit the opposite wall. He said nothing to Debbie that night. In the nights that followed, Alan began sleeping on the floor of the girls' bedroom to help the children through the night. They were too frightened to sleep alone, and he wanted to be close to them. One night he woke in the dark to find a mist rising from the floor near the foot of the bed. It took shape. It formed into something that suggested fire, and inside that shape were eyes that looked directly at him. A voice came out of it and said, plainly and without ambiguity, "You're dead." Then it was gone, and the room was dark, and his daughters were asleep. A few nights after that, a skeptical relative of the family came to stay and help Debbie with the children while Alan worked. This person did not believe in haunting and had made that clear more than once. Alan's absence was meant to be routine. He was going to come home later, and this relative was simply going to help get the kids to bed. But when the relative went into the girls' room to settle the children down, something appeared. Whatever it was enough to make a person who had walked into that house, a committed skeptic, walk out of it changed. Debbie called Pastor Dober. When he arrived at the house that night, he found it in a state that he later described as chaos. He did not spend long deliberating. He told the family to leave the house that night, and on January 11th, 1988, in the middle of a frozen Wisconsin winter, Alan and Debbie Tallman gathered their three children and walked out of the house on Larrabee Street and did not go back. The story of what had happened on Larrabee Street moved through Horicon fast. Within days, the town was buzzing with accounts that grew wilder with each retelling. People said there was a portal to hell in the basement, that blood had dripped from the walls, that the family snowblower had cleared the driveway by itself with nobody operating. None of those details were ever confirmed by the Tallmans themselves, and the family made clear they wanted no part of the circus that was now gathering outside their former home. Cars lined the street day and night. People climbed fences into neighboring yards and pressed their faces against windows. Police barricaded the road at one point and made arrests for disorderly conduct. A man arrived with a Bible and announced he intended to perform an exorcism. He was arrested for drunk driving before he made it to the front door. Horicon Police Chief Doug Glaman had not gone into any of this believing in hauntings. He was a practical man, and his first instinct was that the family had either been pranked or had misunderstood ordinary events in a way that snowballed over time. He met with Alan and Debbie and spent considerable time going through everything they had experienced. By the end of those conversations, Glaman had not become a believer in the paranormal, but he had become convinced that this family had genuinely experienced something that terrified them and that they were not lying about it. He arranged for the house to be examined by a team that included Dr. Don Mueller, an associate professor of social welfare at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who had researched paranormal claims, alongside parapsychologist Carl Schultz and retired professor Walter Uphoff. What conclusions, if any, that team reached were never made fully public. By the following year, after the Unsolved Mysteries broadcast and reports of a book deal surfaced, Glaman publicly walked back some of his earlier statements and said he had grown more skeptical of the story overall. The Tallmans, meanwhile, had one remaining piece of business. They believed with absolute conviction that whatever had entered their home had arrived with the bunk beds. And so in February of 1988, the beds were taken to a private landfill outside Horicon. Debbie described exactly what was done with them. They were taken out there and plowed under. The family was told that nobody would ever build on that spot. The exact location of the landfill has never been made public. The beds were $100 of secondhand furniture, and the family buried them like something that needed to stay buried. The house went up for sale in February of 1988. New owners eventually moved in. By every available account, those owners experienced nothing unusual. The house on Larrabee Street became, once again, a plain ranch home on a quiet residential block in a small Wisconsin farming town. The Tallman case landed on national television in October of 1988 when Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode about it on October 26, 1988, their first ever Halloween broadcast. The family requested that they be filmed in silhouette and that actors portray them in the reenactment. The episode was filmed inside the actual house with the permission of the new owners. It introduced the case to an enormous audience and it has never quite gone away since. The Talmans bought the house with a low interest government loan through a program for low income rural families. Some investigators who looked at the case later suggested that the financial strain of the home, combined with the physical exhaustion of young children and Allen's demanding shift work, created a household already running close to its limits. Under those conditions, ordinary events can be interpreted through a lens of fear. A radio that changes stations, a child's nightmare, a shadow in a hallway. None of those require a supernatural explanation. And the fact that the new owners of the house experienced nothing at all is the kind of detail that a skeptic will point to immediately and reasonably. But there are things the skeptical explanation handles less comfortably. The relative who walked into that bedroom as a declared non-believer and walked out of it without being able to speak about what they saw. The police chief who sat with the family for hours and came away convinced they were not performing. The pastor who entered that house and left it urgently, telling a family to abandon their home that same night. And the children who independently described the same figure in the same terms without having compared accounts. What the Tallman case ultimately leaves you with is this. A young family in a small Midwestern town bought a piece of secondhand furniture for $100. Nearly a year later, they walked out of their home in the middle of a Wisconsin winter night, drove to a landfill, buried the beds in the ground, and told the world they were never going back. Debbie said afterward that she still could not sit alone in the dark without being afraid. That kind of fear is hard to manufacture. That kind of fear lives in a person. And next, we are going to Scotland, to a graveyard in the oldest part of Edinburgh, where in 1999, a man broke open a tomb that had been sealed since 1685. And what came out of it has been leaving people unconscious on the ground ever since. And what came out of it has been leaving people unconscious on the ground ever since. On a freezing, rain-soaked night in December of 1999, a man was wandering through the shadows of Greyfriars Kirkyard in the center of Edinburgh, Scotland. He wasn't there to see the historic monuments or to take a ghost tour. He was homeless, he was soaked to the bone, and he was desperately looking for a place to stay dry. The wind in Edinburgh has a way of cutting right through you, and as he stumbled through the uneven rows of headstones, he finally spotted a large stone structure that looked like it might offer some shelter. This building was known as the Black Mausoleum. It was a grand, vaulted tomb with heavy iron bars protecting the entrance. The man didn't care about who was buried inside. He just saw a roof. He managed to squeeze his way through a small gap in the ironwork and drop down onto the cold stone floor inside. It was pitch black and smelled like damp earth, but it was dry. As he moved around trying to find a place to lay down, his foot caught on a wooden grate in the floor. He pried it up, thinking there might be a softer spot underneath. Instead, he found a steep drop into a lower chamber. In the dark, he lost his footing and fell straight down into a pit filled with the skeletal remains of people who had been buried there centuries ago. As he scrambled to get out, he accidentally smashed through the side of a collapsed, rotted coffin. A thick cloud of ancient gray dust exploded into the air, filling his lungs. Terrified and coughing, the man clawed his way back up to the main level and sprinted out of the mausoleum into the rainy night. He had no idea that by breaking that coffin, he had acted as the spark for something that was about to turn this quiet graveyard into a zone of physical danger. The very next day, a woman was walking her dog near that same mausoleum when she was suddenly knocked unconscious. When she woke up, she told people she felt like a blast of ice cold air had physically shoved her to the ground. Within 48 hours, more reports started coming in. People weren't just seeing things in the fog. They were coming out of the graveyard with physical injuries. One man reported that while he was standing near the tomb, the hot coffee in his hand suddenly turned to ice. Others began noticing long red scratches across their necks and large bruises on their bodies that appeared out of nowhere. As the weeks went by, the reports became impossible for the city of Edinburgh to ignore. This wasn't just a couple of people with overactive imaginations. Dozens of visitors were reporting the exact same thing. They would be walking through the section of the graveyard known as the Covenanters prison, and they would feel a sudden localized drop in temperature. Then they would feel a sharp, stinging sensation on their skin. When they got home and looked in the mirror, they would find fresh welts or scratches, often in sets of three, as if a hand had been dragged across them with incredible force. The activity became so consistent and so aggressive that the city council took a step that almost never happens in a modern city. They officially sealed the gates to the Covenanters prison and declared it off limits to the public. They cited public safety concerns, which was their way of admitting they didn't know how to stop people from getting hurt by something they couldn't see. But the closure only made people more curious. Researchers began arriving with thermal cameras and sensors, trying to find a logical explanation for the physical attack. One researcher decided to take small groups of volunteers into the sealed area to document their reactions. He noticed that the activity was focused entirely on a small radius around the Black Mausoleum. Volunteers would enter the zone feeling fine, but within minutes, they would describe a heavy feeling of being watched. Some would become physically ill, while others experienced sudden, intense bouts of rage that vanished the moment they stepped back outside the gate. It was like the air inside that specific corner of the graveyard was charged with a different kind of energy. But the most disturbing stories were the ones involving transfer. A woman visited the graveyard and felt fine the entire time she was there. But later that night, while she was at home getting into the shower, she felt a burning sensation on her back. When her husband looked, he saw five long red finger marks burned into her skin. It was as if whatever was in that graveyard had followed her home. The researchers began to look deep into the history of the man buried in that tomb, hoping to understand why this place felt so hostile. The man inside the Black Mausoleum was a high ranking legal official from the late 17th century. He was an incredibly intelligent man, but he was also known for being cold and ruthless. His job was to suppress a group of religious dissidents known as the Covenanters, and he did so with absolute efficiency. He was the one responsible for creating the very prison that sat right outside his tomb. Under his orders in the late 1600s, hundreds of men were left to starve and freeze in the open air of the graveyard. He personally oversaw the trials that led to hundreds of executions. Because of his relentless pursuit of the death penalty, he earned a nickname that people in Edinburgh still remember today. They called him Bloody because of how many lives he had taken. When he died in 1691, he was buried in that grand tomb, just yards away from the spot where his victims had suffered. For hundreds of years, local legends said his spirit was trapped inside, unable to find rest because of what he had done. But until that homeless man fell through the floor in 1999, those were just stories told to tourists. The researchers began to wonder if the activity wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a mass of negative energy. If you take a man defined by cruelty and bury him in the exact spot where he caused the most pain, you are essentially creating a pressure cooker. By breaking into the tomb, the intruder hadn't just woken up a spirit, he had provided a way for that energy to interact with the world again. And it was interacting with the same calculated aggression the man has shown in life. The city council eventually allowed a local historian to lead sanctioned tours back into the restricted area, figuring it was better to have people in there with a guide. But the attacks didn't stop. They actually seemed to get more frequent. Between 1999 and 2006, there were over 450 documented physical attacks in that section of the graveyard. People were being slapped and pushed in broad daylight. One tour guide was even knocked unconscious in front of 20 people. The city was facing a crisis where the perpetrator had been dead for 3 centuries. As the number of injuries continued to climb, a local minister named Colin Grant decided he had seen enough. He had spent his life dealing with the spiritual side of Edinburgh, and he believed the energy in the graveyard was becoming truly dangerous. He didn't think science could solve this. He believed it required a ritual to quiet the energy once and for all. In early 2000, he received permission to perform an exorcism inside the Covenanters prison. He entered the graveyard at night with a small group of witnesses and began the ceremony near the Black Mausoleum. Grant later described the atmosphere as suffocating. He said he could feel a presence that was ancient and filled with a pure, calculated hatred. As he began to pray, the temperature in the circle dropped so low that the witnesses could see their breath in thick clouds, even though it was a mild night. Grant stood his ground, calling out the name of the man in the tomb, demanding that the energy leave this place. But halfway through the ritual, Grant suddenly stopped. He looked at the people with him, his face pale with genuine fear. He said, "This is too much. It's going to kill me." He ended the ceremony right then and left the graveyard. Tragically, just a few weeks later, Colin Grant passed away suddenly from a heart attack. He had been in good health, and his sudden death sent a shockwave through the city. Many people believe the stress of what he encountered in the graveyard was more than his heart could take. The Mackenzie Poltergeist, named after the man in the tomb, Sir George Mackenzie, seemed to have claimed one more victim. The city council tightened the restrictions even further, and the Black Mausoleum was once again left in silence. But the name George Mackenzie is still spoken in hushed tones. He was a man who spent his life using the law to trap and punish people, and it seems he found a way to continue that work from the grave. The tomb remains one of the most feared locations in Scotland. The scratches and bruises are real, and the history is undeniable. Sir George Mackenzie was a man who never showed mercy in life, and 300 years later, he still isn't showing any. If you visit Greyfriars Kirkyard today, you will see a sign on the gate of the Covenanters prison warning you that you enter at your own risk. It is one of the only places in the world where a modern government officially acknowledges a physical threat they cannot explain. The Mackenzie poltergeist is now the most well-documented case of its kind, with logs of injuries filling multiple volumes in the city archives. It is a record of a place that simply refuses to be at peace. These cases remind us that the world we see is only a small part of the reality we live in. We like to think that once someone is gone, they are gone. We like to think that a locked door or a stone wall is enough to keep us safe. But as the man who fell into that pit discovered, some things don't stay buried. Sometimes the history of a place is so heavy that it spills over into the present. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is go looking for a place to hide from the rain. Because you might just find yourself in a room with a man like George Mackenzie, and he has been waiting a very long time for someone to walk through his door